Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on pawn breaks in the middle game. I put up this list of key points that I was trying to make in this series of videos. I have a couple more examples to show you from some more modern games, so I thought I'd go over this list first. You can keep this in mind, think of how it applied to the examples I showed last time, and see how it applies in the examples I'm going to show you. The first point is that you play a pawn break. It's usually not a make or break move in a game. It's not something that turns the game around instantly, but it adds some dynamic possibilities to the position. The side that plays the pawn break, I think, has some kind of psychological advantage, if not a actual advantage on the board, because the side that plays the pawn break has three possibilities. He can maintain the tension, he can exchange and open a file immediately, or he can push the pawn forward. Whereas the side that is defending against the pawn break really only has two choices, either to maintain the tension or to exchange. So it's a little bit, there's just that increased flexibility that the side that plays the pawn break has that can be used as an advantage. So if you want to increase the pressure on your opponent, then after you play the pawn break, you can just maintain the tension there. And then every time your opponent makes a move, he has to calculate, oh, what's going to happen if you take, what's going to happen if you push. And maybe at some point they will fold under the pressure and decide to take or make some other bad move. Taking is not always a bad move. I don't mean to imply that, but just keeping the tension there, increases the load on your opponent. You can exchange at any time, and that will open a line for you and also open up some squares for your pieces. Now, exchanging is always a double-edged sword. Not only does it open up places for your pieces, but it opens up places for your opponent's pieces. So keep that in mind. And another idea you can have is just increasing the tension. While you're maintaining the tension there, you can just pile up the pressure and see if you can force your opponent to take, which sometimes you want to do because you can recapture with either a piece or a pawn, and that might be an improvement in your structure. Let's say the next point I wanted to make is that in a closed position, you want to maintain some kind of pawn break possibility so that you can open up the position at a time of your choice. Otherwise, a closed position may just lock up completely and turn into a draw when neither side can break through. So I think in a closed position, always try and keep a pawn break available. The next point is that your opponent will have some pawn breaks too. Sometimes you want to try and clamp down on the pawn break. We'll see an example of that coming up to try and prevent counterplay from your opponent. If you can just prevent him from making that pawn break, say he's got a pawn break on one side of the board and you're attacking on the other side, maybe you want to keep that side closed so your opponent doesn't get counterplay over there. So keeping a clamp on that pawn break is often a good idea in cases like that. And the flip side of that is if you've reached a point on one side of the board where you can't make any progress, sometimes you can open up, you play a pawn break on the other side of the board to open some lines and open up a second front. So it's just useful to keep these pawn break possibilities around. Okay, let's take a look at the first game here. This game was played in 2013 at the Baku opening. With the white pieces, we have Adilsdv, and with the black pieces, we have Irina Krush, the many-time U.S. women's champion. And in 2013, that was the year she got her final Grandmaster norm and became a Grandmaster. So this was a time when she was traveling the world and playing at mini tournaments, trying to get that final Grandmaster norm. So let's see, Sevdamaliev starts off with e4 here. And we get a Sicilian to start with, although this game goes through a few wrinkles. Krish goes for a e6 Sicilian, and then white plays with c4. So now it looks more like some kind of English opening, and this impression is strengthened when black plays e5. So this looks like a symmetrical English. It's not the Botvinnik setup because of the placement of the pieces here. The knight would be here if that were a Botvinnik setup, and this bishop would be fianchettoed over here. So that's not what white is going for. And in this position, Irina Krush plays the first pawn break. I should say, whenever you have this locked up center, and there are pawn breaks on both sides. And yeah, so Krush goes for this one immediately. This is maybe a bit of a risky decision. It is opening up lines on the king side. It doesn't seem like white can immediately exploit this, however. It's a closed center, so it'll take a little bit of maneuvering for white to develop any kind of attack there. And in the meantime, black is looking to get counterplay along the f-file. And also there's a danger that this pawn could just push forward. This is a case where the push is maybe as dangerous as the exchange to open a line, because when the pawn pushes forward, it restricts this bishop, and then black can follow up with a move like g4, or g5 rather, maybe even g4, and gain a lot of space on the king side, and it starts to look like the kind of attack you might get in the king's Indian defense. So white wanted to avoid that and just decided to take there. But this has the side effect of bringing one of black's pieces forward, so that this little transaction helped black's development and opened up a line on the f-file. And now white continues with the move knight to d5. Now knight d5 doesn't look like a bad move, but there's some latent problems here. It'll show up later. Actually, the chess engine is recommending dropping this knight back to d2, perhaps with the idea of pushing the f-pawn forward and trying to undermine the center. One thing about the knight here, although it's well placed, it's only supported by a single pawn, and so there are exchanges that can happen here that will leave white with a weakened pawn structure. So maybe that's why that's a bit risky to play that. Anyway, Irina continues with bishop to e7. She's not worried about the knight taking the bishop. This is not such a great piece, and actually this knight is really well placed there. So neither side, I mean, black would not be unhappy if white took, but white is not going to take. White's going to keep that bishop, or keep that knight there in a good square. So white goes ahead and castles here. The knight comes out to f6, challenging the knight here. Now a3, preparing a pawn break on the other side. Also maybe just keeping this knight out of this square, but we'll see after black castles, white goes for the pawn break right away. So that was most likely the intention there from the beginning. This move is actually rated as a slight mistake by the chess engine. So if we back up, what the chess engine would play here instead is taking knight takes f6 here. That's a tempo move. It comes with check. And then after taking back, just developing the bishop. And it would leave this pawn break for later. This pawn break is not going away immediately, although, you know, this does give black the chance to clamp down on the pawn break. So maybe that's why white felt like it was important to play that right away. Anyway, we'll see why this particular pawn break is a slight mistake immediately. Because, well, normally I said black, the side that's defending against the pawn break, has two choices, either to exchange or to maintain the tension. But Irina finds a third option here, which is kind of clever. She takes this knight, and after the knight takes back, plays knight to d4. So this is a good knight. And, well, there is still the tension. The tension has been maintained for a few moves, and white could take that pawn here, but maybe white doesn't want to lose this bishop, which is defending this pawn here. And because of the trade, white did get into a situation where white has these double isolated pawns, so those are going to be weak for the rest of the game probably, and so white needs to take care that they don't just disappear. So white goes ahead and takes the knight, and Irina takes back with the c pawn. And now the tension has disappeared. So she's gotten rid of the tension and without having to exchange. So there was a third option there, kind of a special case. Anyway, things have kind of settled down on the queen side here. There's not a whole lot to be done here. I mean, both sides can place their rook on the open file, but there's not minor pieces that can hop in to various places. They're just not... and this bishop can't really get into the game on this side. So so white turns, his attention to playing on the king side here and pushes on with f4. So Irina plays queen to d7, lifting the queen up off the back rank and lining up with this bishop. Let's see here. The next move is g4. Yeah, this is an interesting move by white. So white decides, rather than taking here, he's just going to leave the tension there. This is not the same as a pawn break because black always has the option of pushing forward. So that f4 move was not really a pawn break, but it has some similarities in that white can either take or maintain the tension or push forward. And white is choosing to push forward this way by kicking the bishop first with the g-pawn and then pushing on, not exchanging, pushing on with the f-pawn and kicking that bishop again. So white has gained a lot of space on the king side and maybe can get an attack going in the long run. But there is immediate pressure on the center pawn from black, so white has to worry about that too. Bishop to f3 to defend. Now rook a to c8, putting the rook on an open file. Bishop d2, getting the bishop off the back rank and preparing to oppose on the c file. Bishop to h4. There seems to be a little bit of shuffling going on here, but we'll see the point in a second. Bishop to e4 was played, so this is a very solid spot for this bishop, although it's kind of locked in behind the pawns. Maybe this one can come forward at some point and unleash an attack like this. So it's not without its points putting the bishop here. It's anchored by this pawn and it's defending this pawn. So a solid setup in the center, preventing black's pawns from coming forward. So queen e7 was played by Irina, and now rook to c1, opposing rook. So both sides have pretty much completed their development, now getting all their pieces out. And Irina makes the interesting decision to play bishop to g5. And this pretty much forces an exchange. You know, if the bishop moves away, then black can just take that rook. So it's hard to avoid this exchange. I mean, black does throw in rook takes c8. But even after this, there's no good square for this bishop. It can't come here because, well, it's covered. And if it goes here, then that opens up this diagonal and the rook can come into the c1 square, winning. Or I don't know if that actually wins, but it looks pretty dangerous. So anyway, yeah, white is kind of stuck here for a move with that dark squared bishop. So f6 was played. Irina takes back with a pawn, and then finally white goes ahead and trades bishops. So that was a choice by black to trade off the dark squared bishop and just leave a position with light squared bishops. And it looks like an interesting and good decision. All of these pawns in the center are on dark squares, and white's pawns, on the other hand, are on light squares, so that they can come under attack by this light squared bishop, whereas this light squared bishop has no way of attacking these dark squared pawns. So that was a strategic bishop trade to take advantage of the change in the pawn structure that had occurred earlier. So queen to f3 was played. White has also gone down this path, looking to get some counterplay here on the king side. The rook comes over to f8 to defend. And now a4. This seems to be a slight mistake, putting another pawn on a light square. Let's see how this gets exploited. King to g7, the king steps up, getting off the light squares. And king to g2. And after king g2, which seems a harmless enough move, actually it seems like this is a losing position for white, interestingly enough. Let's back up a move here. After, oops. Cancel that. So after this pawn came forward, the king stepped up. In this position, yeah, this pawn needed to get off the light square here. This was a necessary move, and that's why the previous move, the other move that white played, which was pushing the king forward, that was a mistake. And now Irina takes advantage of this by relocating this bishop with tempo. So the bishop comes to e8, hitting this pawn, and it also is forcing some exchanges on this file. White decides to go all the way into a endgame by taking. Black takes back, white takes, and black takes. But this endgame is just good for black. Now there was time here to save the pawn. All those exchanges were forcing. This pawn over here, because the king got dragged away, is under fire, so it has to come forward. But there's still these permanent weaknesses in White's camp that black can exploit. So watch how Irina plays this. Well, first it's White's turn, so the king comes up to f3. Bishop goes to d7, hitting the pawn. King goes over to g3. A little bit of shuffling going on here. And now the king comes up to e7. This bishop drops back to f3. The king runs over to d8. What black is trying to do is come over here and break through on the king side. Notice that White's king can't really break into black's camp here, so White's king is kind of stuck there. And black's king is mobile. Black's king can come out here and go after these pawns, and that's going to be the deciding factor in this endgame. Let's see. Bishop to d1 was played, and bishop out to b5. So the bishop is now attacking this pawn, another one of the weaknesses in White's camp. Bishop comes to defend. King steps up to e7. A little back and forth there. King goes to f3, and then pawn to b6. So this is going to be a decisive exchange here. If this pawn comes forward, it just gets traded off. So White in this position chooses to play king to e4, hoping to break into the camp, break into black's camp this way. But black takes here first, and then drops the bishop back to d7, once again preventing black from coming into the camp, and preventing White from coming into black's camp. And White just resigned here. This is actually the end of the game. The problem is that black has a simple plan of coming over here and taking this pawn, which is on a dark square, and there's nothing that White can do to prevent that. And if the pawn comes forward, well, the pawn comes forward, the king can march to this square, and the bishop can take it. So at the end of the day, black is just going to get a passed pawn over here on the queen side, and there's not much. There's actually nothing that White can do about it. If White tries a maneuver like this to bring this pawn around, black can get the bishop up here first, and this exchange is going to be really bad for White, because it'll give black a passed pawn here, which will keep the king tied down, and once again black's king can walk over here and gobble up the last pawn on the queen side. So there's just no defense for White in this position, and White resigned. Okay, let's take a look at the next game. The last game I wanted to show you was played in 2017 at the European Individual Championship. It was played between Hovhannes Gaban, who's a promising young Armenian grandmaster, and his opponent with the black pieces is Gaban Jones, a veteran English grandmaster. So top-level clash here. Gaban starts off with the move g3, the Binko opening. Pretty rare move, actually, at the top level, but this tends to transpose to other openings with the kingside fianchetto, and we see that here. Gaban Jones just plays g6, a symmetrical response. And then after e4, now this starts to look like a King's Indian attack, but, well, it doesn't stay there. I mean, this could be a Sicilian at this point with the e4, c5, and this is a modern way of playing the Sicilian with the fianchetto. Let's continue. But actually, White has a different idea, and after a few moves, we see c4 here. And Now this is the, well, I'll go on one more move. This is the Botvinnik setup with the fianchettoed bishop, the two knights here and here, and this pawn triangle. So it's a setup that I like to play myself. It's you have a pawn break on this side, and well, if black plays this pawn up, you'll have a pawn break on this side. But in either case, you'll be able to push this pawn forward and get a kingside attack, or switch your attention to the queen side. So it's a pretty flexible opening with a closed center, so very solid in the center. Gawain Jones continues with a6 here, and Gabuzian plays a4. So this a6 move was threatening to push with b5 and play the pawn break there. And so this is a clamp. This is an example of clamping down on a pawn break. So what Gabuzian wants from this position is he wants to have a free hand to attack on the king side, and so he just wants to stop any counterplay from black on the queen side. And the queen side is the natural side for black to get play on, with this good bishop striking down the diagonal and this hole. The one of the weaknesses, I guess I should say, of the Botvinnik setup is this hole on d4. So anyway, that's a basic strategy here. Black castles here. White continues with a3, a common move. This is usually played to prepare bishop to e3. You want to prevent the knight from coming here and harassing that bishop on e3. And the king can actually tuck itself away on h2, pretty conveniently defending the h3 pawn. So it's not actually a weakness in this setup, typically. So knight to e8 was played. Gawain Jones is maybe thinking of getting counterplay on the king side here, if this clamp prevents him from playing on the queen side. Anyway, it's an option here. So bishop to e3 was played, and now he goes with e5. So now we have pawn breaks on both sides of the board, here and here, and here and here, although these are, this one at least is clamped down on at the moment. And Gabuzian plays the pawn break immediately, goes with f4. And Gawain here decides to play knight to d4, keeping the tension. This is kind of similar to what we saw in the previous game with the opposite colors, but the difference here is that black has two pawns supporting the knight, whereas in the other game, in the previous game, we saw white jumping up knight up here in response to a pawn break, but the knight was only supported by a single pawn, and it became a weakness later. This is pretty solid for black. And so white at this point decides to bring his pawn forward too. But, well, this does something. The knight was doing a job back here. The knight was doing a job keeping a clamp on the b5 pawn break. And once the knight has come forward to d5, that pawn break is on, and Gawain plays it immediately. So this was obviously a decision that the Armenian Grandmaster took consciously. He decided it was better to give up the queen side, give up the pawn break on the queen side, and get this excellent knight here looking at the dark squares over here on the king side, maybe over here too. There's a lot of possibilities. That's a strong knight there. But it is a trade-off, and as I said, it gave up the clamp on the pawn break, and Gawain plays it immediately. So Gabuzian takes once and then takes again. Now, it wasn't necessary to take there, actually. It was a possibility to just leave the tension here. I think the pawn push here does not look that dangerous to me. So, I mean, both options are playable. He could either take or leave it, but it's not like this exchange was forced. And it does leave a weakness. We have, well, white is a pawn up momentarily, but of course this pawn can be rounded up, and this pawn will be weak back here. So it is leaving some weakness behind. What Gabuzian is looking for here is dynamic counterplay on the king side. So let's see, knight to c7 was played. Just bringing this knight back into the game. It was sitting on the back rank there. And then knight e to c3 was played. Actually, this seems to be a slight mistake, although it seemed pretty natural. White is trying to maintain a good knight here, so if this gets traded off, a new knight will hop forward. Let's back up. The chess engine, however, is recommending taking that knight. When the knight comes to c7, just taking immediately. Thinks black will throw in this exchange. This is a tempo move because it goes with check. And then take here, another tempo move because it hits the bishop. And then finally taking back the knight. But white has gained a pretty good looking pawn center. Is still about an even position. These pawns over here are still weak. So this should be playable for both sides. That is recommended line by the chess engine in this position. Anyway, as I said, Gabusian played the move that seems pretty logical to me, knight e to c3, just shoring up the center. So Gawain trades off one pair of knights, and Gabusian takes back, maintaining the knight there. And now it's black's turn, and black gets to take here. So finally the tension is being resolved. And it's interesting that white did not choose to take with a pawn. I didn't actually look at this to see if there was a tactical reason. But there's actually a justification for putting the bishop there. It's looking at this weak pawn in black structure, so that makes sense as well. But I think that pawn takes would have been a playable response there too. Anyway, knight takes b5, finally rounding up this loose pawn here. So the pawns are even, but also this pawn is under fire. And actually, white is going to go down a pawn here shortly. But it's white's turn. White pushes on with h4, maybe looking to do something with this bishop, so resolving the situation with that pawn. Also maybe looking to bring this bishop forward to harass the queen and do something on the dark squares. The knight drops back to c7. Bishop goes to g5. Okay, so that was the idea there. But black plays f6. So black is not giving ground here on the dark squares. He needs to keep control of them because it was pretty dangerous. The knight was looking at these squares, the bishop and the rook. But well, f6, although it may be a weakness later from the point of view of pawn structure, it's necessary to maintain control of the dark squares here. So the bishop drops back to f4, looking at this pawn again. And the knight takes on d5. And once again, we see this weakened pawn structure in the center, as well as a loose pawn over here. So there's been some gain for black in this last series of exchanges. In fact, black immediately grabs the profit there and takes the extra pawn. So white continues with rook to e1, placing the rook on an open file. Black goes with g5, kicking the bishop. White could take here, but black would take back and the bishop would have to move anyway. So the bishop drops back to c1, kicking that rook, and it leaves. It departs the camp and runs back to b7. It didn't have any great activity there. I mean, it would be good if it could maintain itself there, but it didn't have any good square it could move to there. So rook b7 seems fine. Now this rook comes in. This may be one of the points of white's play was white's able to activate this rook. Black unpins by moving the queen to d7. Queen steps up to e2 here, taking control of the e-file. Although, yeah, I think at this point, black cannot oppose there. So rook to b1 was played. This is an interesting move. So there's pressure from this rook on the back rank, but there's pressure from this rook on the back rank as well. And this slows down this idea of the queen penetrating because white or black can trade off and then grab this bishop with check. So the queen doesn't go all the way to e7, but runs into e6. It seems like white wanted to go into an endgame at this point. Maybe thought his chances were best there. So queen takes and pawn takes. The rook needs to stay back defending the bishop. But, well, that rook is overloaded, and black can exploit it like this. So it looks, at first, maybe like black is just winning another pawn here. But, in fact, there's a clever sequence here that white has in mind. So Well, white just goes ahead and takes that bishop. Black takes this bishop. So that was the trade. But this rook has gotten into a good position, and black is going to be able to get the pawn back. So the king goes to h2. Oh, this king is in check, right? It goes to h2. This rook goes to c2. Excuse me, it's black's turn. Rook goes to c2. Now rook takes, check. Bishop takes. And, the bishop, I guess Gawain decided it was better to protect this pawn than the other one. So white takes the pawn over here. So at this point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, black has remained a pawn up, but he didn't go 2 pawns up. So black has been a pawn up since he grabbed that pawn on b7 there. So the bishop goes to e7. Yeah, I pressed the wrong button there. Bishop goes to e7, kicking the rook. The rook goes to e6, and the king steps forward, defending the bishop and harassing the rook again. The rook runs over to h6, and now g takes h4 was played. This is interesting. Black is actually giving the pawn back, momentarily at least, but it looks like this is going to result in a good position for black at the end. So black goes ahead and takes this pawn, allowing this pawn to go with check. And then the king steps forward to e6, and then taking that pawn. So now it's even. There's 2 pawns to 2 pawns. But what Gawain Jones has seen is that this pawn can be stopped with this between the king and the dark squared bishop. He's got enough force in the neighborhood to stop that pawn from queening, and this pawn is weak and is going to fall, and that's what happens in the endgame. Pretty far-seeing play from Gawain, if you ask me. So rook to d2, just rounding up that d pawn. h5, the h pawn starts running. Bishop to f6, going to a place that will stop it. The pawn comes forward again. Now the bishop goes here with check. Now we're on move 38 here. So there's probably a time control at move 40, because what we see here is a shuffle of the bishop going back and forth, and then finally he takes the pawn. So now we're on move 42. So he just threw in a couple of moves to make the time control. So I guess he was low on time there, having calculated that out. Having calculated that sequence earlier, used up all his time, and so he had to get to the time control. And now he's free to take the pawn and figure out how he's going to win this endgame. So rook comes over to c7, plays the check again. King goes back to g1. Rook relocates. The h-pawn runs one more step forward, but it's not going anywhere after that with the rook and the bishop coordinating on the h8 square. It's got nowhere to run anymore. And the king comes over to try and get in front of the black pawns. The pawns start running. And notice that both those squares were protected. This square is protected by the rook, and the square it's on now is protected by the bishop. The king runs up. d5, the other pawn hurries to catch its partner. And there it goes. So the pawns are connected again. The bishop maneuvers to try and stop the pawns. The king comes forward, and now the check drives the white king back, and rook comes all the way to d2, picking up the bishop. So it's basically hopeless at this point because, well, I mean, he didn't win the whole bishop because white can just take that one, and black has to hurry back in time to stop this pawn from queening. But with these 2 pawns, it's a pretty easy endgame win, and white resigned at this point. If the king comes forward, then the rook can come here to drive the king even further forward, and then the pawn will promote, or the king goes back, and then the pawns can just march. There's no stopping them. In fact, if the king just goes straight back, the pawn comes forward. There's a mate threat, so the checks will run out if the king marches towards the rook, and then there's a mate. So anyway, a lot of different ways to win this position for black, and white resigned. So that's it for this series. So my next topic in this middle game series is going to be top 10 middle game ideas number 9, the Spanish torture. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you then. Bye now.